So welcome to the final week of our social psychology journey. Today, I'm going to cover a couple of things that lead to social psychology being given the heat, to criticisms of social psychology, starting from some very fundamental criticisms of the whole method with the underlying assumptions, and ending with some much more practical, critical thoughts on relationships between attitudes and behaviors, given that typically we care about behaviors and study attitudes. As per usual, I split this up into separate sections. In this first section, I'm going to talk about critiques of the quantitative approach, which is basically 95% of what we have considered in this module so far. And for that, I briefly need to go back to what I talked about at the very beginning, about the origins of psychology as a science. Because psychology started about 150 years ago, looking at questions that were much, much older. But psychologists wanted to distinguish themselves from philosophers who had been pondering human nature, human relationships, human well-being for a long time. So they didn't want to ponder in the armchair, but they quite quickly wanted to find a way of doing science, a science of human nature, of human mental faculties, and so on. So the scientific method was quite foundational for psychology from the start. What does it mean? Well, it means that most of psychology is done through quantitative research. Quantitative research, at its heart, it's about collecting some kind of numbers, using statistical methods to ascribe those numbers and draw conclusions about the world. But it requires a certain world view. And in philosophy of science, there are generally two big questions. The first big question is around ontology. So, what exists? And in order to be able to do quantitative research, we have to assume that the things we want to study actually exist. They're not just in individual minds, they're not created intersubjectively, but actually those things exist out there. And we also have to assume that there are some objective truths about relationships, about the number of people in a group and the degree of conformity that engenders. We have to assume that there is some objective truth about that relationship, not just opinions, not just an infinite variety. Because for the whole idea of measurement and generalization to make sense, we have to expect that the relationships we uncover are somewhat universal. Because we don't have to expect that they hold for every single person in every single circumstance. But we also can't assume that they completely change from situation to situation. And that package of assumptions is called realism. So a focus on the world being out there, being distinct from us. And then for that to be meaningful, we have to answer the second question, which is around epistemology. So how can we reach knowledge? And for quantitative research, the idea of how we can gain knowledge is by categorizing and counting to a large extent. So we have a complex social world, but we can think of distinctive categories, different types of attitudes, different types of love, and we can measure it in some way. And if that is the case, then we can get closer to the truth by doing incremental science. I do a specific project, test a couple of hypotheses, you pick up where I left off and continue. And we get closer to the truth that is said in the ontology, the truth that exists out there. If we buy into these assumptions, none of which feel particularly radical, but if we buy into them, then social science is about systematically observing the world, developing hypotheses, running experiments, seeing whether they're falsified or whether they match the data, and trying to work on developing objective facts, fairly general laws, and identify causal explanations. And if we are looking for causal explanations, we need experimental manipulations. Anything else ultimately only allows us to describe what we see, but not to derive cause and effect. And I put a picture of the lab code up here because that is fundamentally what natural sciences also do. How medical research is done, how research in physics is done, and so on. Now, some people say that that's fundamentally an inappropriate model for the subject area we're looking at in social psychology. So why would that be? What is this qualitative critique? It's basically questioning whether we can actually describe social reality in any meaningful way by reducing it to a couple of variables that are numerically measurable. Quality isn't about high quality here. It's more about the meaning. So quantitative research is about counting. Qualitative research is about trying to understand the nature of things in a language-based way. And the qualitative critique would then ask, are there objective things out there? Is an objective reality where we can find beauty, where we can find prejudice? Or are we collectively creating them? Do these things only exist because we talk about them and because we together share certain thoughts? And if that is the case, does a model that assumes that they're out there independent of the researcher, does the model make sense? And can we even try to study individuals in this unbiased way as neutral researchers in our lab codes? Or do we need to recognize that we are always part of the experiment? That we are always all together in a specific society, in a specific shared reality? And of course, that's very much linked to the question whether there can be neutral observers. Can I ever run an experiment, especially about social attitudes, that's not influenced by the fact that I'm a white male? Or does that fact always put me into a specific relationship constructed through our social hierarchies? Does it always put me in a specific relationship with research participants? So if it does, then it's very problematic, because then suddenly you replicating my experiment cannot really replicate that particular experiment because you can't replicate me. So quantitative research is quite heavily premised on there being a neutral experimental situation. The qualitative critique would say that doesn't exist. And let's look at a couple of specific elements of that critique. So if we have this idea of abstracting research from complicated social realities by running it in a lab, what does that mean? Well, a couple of subjects come into the lab who have a very specific role. subjects are to be subjected. They're people who follow someone else's orders. And for that reason, we're not calling them subjects anymore. We now have research participants. Modern articles don't talk about subjects, but the idea hasn't really changed. The schema, the role that people play is to come into a room and do what they are told, and often do something quite strange. Not a very natural setting. And that doesn't really match the real world, because in the real world, we have whole interconnected situations with people from different groups who are all members of many groups, relate to each other through all kinds of relationships. So I quite like this illustration of trying to study a complicated elephant by looking at specific parts of it and describing those specific parts in a lot of detail. Ultimately, we'll probably not learn anything of essence about the elephant by getting a very detailed description of a particular patch of its skin. So outside the lab issue design context, do we still have something meaningful if we strip all that context? And all quantitative researchers recognize that. It's what we discuss as ecological validity. But some qualitative researchers will say through this whole method, you basically lose the chance to do research that has ecological validity. It's important to think quite specifically about how the experimental situation might influence what we are trying to research. Because those influences are really not desirable if we try to see the reality that's out there. And one concept there are demand characteristics, where the situation that participants are in communicates to them what the desirable responses, behaviors would be. And if we have those, then we already talked about compliance, we talked about our desire to be liked and accepted in a group. So if we know what's expected of us, and it's not really painful or costly to fulfill the expectation, we'll often do it. So demand characteristics might just mean that participants try to show the experimenter what they think the experimenter wants to see. And similarly, experimenter bias might then also quickly lead to something along the lines of what we discussed as self-fulfilling prophecies, where an experimenter who believes that a certain situation will lead to higher levels of motivation, higher levels of compliance, might project those expectations in a way that makes them come true. So the quantitative researcher solution to that is this idea of running blinded experiments. We say it's quite important that the participants don't know what the hypotheses are, so that they don't feel the demand to confirm those hypotheses. And ideally, the people running the experiment also shouldn't know what those hypotheses are. So for example, in educational experiment, where you test whether specific types of instructions are better than others, none of the students should know which you think is the best, and none of the teachers should know which you think is the best. They should all know that they are just getting one of various experiences. Because if you have that, you don't run the risk of either participants responding to demand or experimenters introducing bias. In quantitative research, we might have a big problem with the participant pool that we typically still work with. A lot of psychological research is conducted on undergraduate psychology students. You'll get your chance to participate in some of those research projects during your degree. They're a great way to learn about psychology. But what about the quality of knowledge that creates? It is a bit dubious, but it's still pursued because you are there, you're much easier to access than representative adult population samples who will all need to be paid. But it means that when we are studying humans and we are making conclusions about human nature, we are still typically just talking about people from what has been called weird backgrounds, people from majority white countries who are educated, from industrialized, rich, democratic societies. And given that a lot of the world is weird, that's fair enough, but we at least then really need to make sure to remember that we're not talking about humans, but we are talking about weird humans in most of our results. Even more importantly, undergraduate students are not real adults. And quite often that's not really considered in social psychology. And they're not in a setting that's at all unbiased. Educational settings are all about compliance. Mass education only works when everyone knows their place. So we study these young people who are kind of emerging into adulthood, but not behaving as kind of normal adults would, who are in a setting where compliance is expected. And then we draw conclusions about global human nature. That's an area where then people who say, what are you up to, all this quantitative research, definitely can bring up many valid criticisms. Just to show you one very extreme example that was published in a reasonably good journal not very long ago. There's this interesting research question about the importance of virginity loss, so the importance of your first sexual experience on long-term sexual satisfaction. And then they did some research, they wrote an abstract that shared really quite interesting findings. One's first-time sexual experience appeared to have implications for sexual well-being years later. So who would you expect them to study? And ideally, a diverse group of people who had quite a few sexual experiences since their first time over a period of multiple years. Who did they study? Well, they studied psychology students just under 19 years old on average. Those psychology students had lost their virginity just 2 years earlier on average. So already quite a difficult thing to now talk about sexual satisfaction years later. And given that most of these 19-year-olds will not be in long-term relationships, you can also only talk about quite a specific type of sexual satisfaction. There are lots of other issues with that study. If you want a piece of research to practice your critical thinking on, go and read it. But the choice of sample really didn't fit the research question here. And in slightly less extreme ways, you can notice that very often. Moving on from these methodological criticisms about how we often conduct research in social psychology, I want to talk about a couple of criticisms that are more about the kind of questions we ask and how we think about the issues we're interested in. And the first big criticism is that a lot of the research is very individualistic, which means that often we locate problems just in an individual. So in this body image example, the psychological research question would be, what are the personality predictors, what are the personal factors that lead to people perceiving issues with their weight? And that can be very helpful if we want to fix the personal psychology of anorexic girls. The question is whether that's always the most appropriate way of thinking about how to approach an issue. Another example might be around anxiety. We have had a debate with some of my teachers at university whether the question of how we can support individual students in coping with anxiety is the most important question to ask, or whether there might be questions about the structure of schooling that might reduce anxiety in general without fixing individual students. And for some of the people really pushing for a whole different kind of psychology, this is a problem because it really misattributes blame. Because fixing individuals justifies the system. And if you agree with something like this perspective, that we really live in a society where lots of things are fundamentally wrong, then it's important to think about what kind of changes you want to work towards and you think psychology as a field should work towards. Because if there are fundamental things wrong in our social arrangements, then working to equip individuals to cope with those arrangements might not quite be the right way forward. We might also at times cause problems in our research by asking people to choose between specific options. On a very simple level, this idea of quantification might just lead to people kind of having to make up an opinion that they don't have. Because often they can't say, well, I haven't really thought about that, and these are my different viewpoints, but often we ask them, well, on a scale from 1 to 5, which number do you pick? And this kind of creates then an in-the-moment response that's often quite easy to influence, either accidentally or consciously, and either of those doesn't really help with developing real knowledge. An example for how this can be done consciously, and is often done consciously, is by choosing a question format that's likely to give you the answer that you want to hear. So we often ask agree or disagree items. Here, for example, the Pew Research Center asked people, some people say the best way to ensure peace is through military strength. Do you agree or disagree? Well, they found a majority that agreed. An alternative way of measuring the same thing is to give people two different statements. The best way to ensure peace is through military strength, or diplomacy is the best way to ensure peace. With that forced choice, you suddenly get the opposite result. Now majority is in favor of peace and diplomacy rather than military strength. Often, this is not a huge issue because often we are only interested in relationships. We're only interested in whether people who are more supportive of the military might be, I don't know, less supportive of immigration. And then it doesn't really matter what the absolute levels are. But especially if you want to make any claims about absolute levels, how many people hold prejudicial beliefs, it's very important to think about what choices they were given, and how the way those choices were given might influence the results. For example, which is acquiescence bias, where the option to agree is often liked, which then leads to higher agreement than if you have something like a forced choice format. A final, very fundamental criticism is the idea of dehumanization, where some qualitative researchers argue that quantification, reducing experiences to statistics, always loses essential meaning and might actually devalue suffering. I'm personally not hugely convinced by this criticism as a criticism of the method, but I think it's a very important reminder that for experimental or research participants, often the topics we study are hugely meaningful. And then it certainly matters to think about how to respect their experiences, how to avoid asking questions that have the potential to cause harm. There are lots of ethical questions definitely related to this dehumanization if we sometimes just see people as sources of data, sources of numeric responses. So what do we do with these critiques? One option is to really take them on and embrace what's often called critical social psychology, which to a large extent is just qualitative social psychology that rejects the quantitative method, or at least a focus on the quantitative method. So if you want to do that, or people who want to do that, you need to prioritize qualitative over quantitative data. And often that then also leads to researchers prioritizing advocacy over neutrality and objectivity in their research, because in that understanding of reality and of the research process, neutrality and objectivity don't exist anyway. There are also many quantitative mainstream social psychologists who engage in advocacy, but they tend to see it as a separate step from the research. And this critical social psychology that prioritizes qualitative data is very much a minority position, but it is an option for people who find these criticisms very compelling, especially the more fundamental ones. The alternative is to take them on board in mainstream social psychology. For example, by really thinking about the social context of research, by considering the role of language, by looking not just at averages, but at the experience of different groups, and especially at the experience of minority groups that are often overlooked. And by being aware of and wary of weird samples. And clearly by being really focused on research ethics, in terms of being respectful of participants, understanding that they are not just sources of data, and that any research has social impact. And for me, that's the more convincing way to respond to the critiques, rather than to just give up on quantitative social psychology, because I think there is quite a lot to be said in its favor. One aspect that I think is very valuable is to have these clear standards to decide between theories. With the quantitative approach, we just need to be creative enough to come up with an experiment where we can clearly define what kind of data would support your theory over mine when we run the experiment, and we can move on from an agreed position. When you do qualitative research, it's much harder, it's much more common to have parallel schools of thought that can't really be reconciled and united anymore. With that comes the ability to generate knowledge that builds on itself, and the ability to decide empirically which findings are universal and which findings are specific to weird samples, for example. And ultimately, if anything is universal, that seems to be worth knowing. Two more practical arguments would be that disciplines that prioritize the subjective and the qualitative way of making sense of the world exist. And many of them study questions that are similar in nature to those of social psychology. So a lot of anthropology is concerned with similar issues and takes all these critiques very seriously. So there might just be no need to replicate it. Maybe there is value in methodological pluralism, where social psychology can be the quantitative discipline in exchange with, for example, anthropology. And in the current reality, at least, quantitative results seem to be a lot more likely to influence decisions in terms of policy, and even to just get reported. Disaster. And as a more practical argument, qualitative qualitative disciplines that prioritize the subjective experience exist. Anthropology, for example, deals with many of the same questions as social psychology, just using a different methodology. And to me, there seems to be space for both and for them to stand in exchange, rather than for either approach to be seen as superior. And very practically, at present, quantitative results seem to be a lot more likely to be reported and to be able to influence decision making. But there can be different opinions on this. There are some things you really need to know for moving on in psychology, and then there are other things where you will need to develop your viewpoints over the next couple of years. I encourage you to take a moment to really collect your thoughts here. So firstly, just to make sure that you can describe the difference between these worldviews underpinning quantitative and qualitative research. Then to reflect on the criticisms that I highlighted, probably by going back to the slides, since there were so many different points, and thinking about which you might agree with. And obviously, as always, it's a good idea to now note down any questions that you have, so that we can address them together. Once you've done that, I'll see you back here for the next video.